Good afternoon to everybody. Welcome to everybody that is here in person and to those that are online. So please, those who want to join this session, please come ahead. We'll be speaking here on corporate roads to net zero, from science to reality. This is the title of this panel. Actually talking about how companies are reaching net zero, and what is the commitment of the private sector to align with the Paris Agreement. So companies are applying different frameworks to set interim and long-term science-aligned targets to decarbonize as fast and efficient as possible. And we were speaking on challenges and barriers to take action, and based on the limited also capacities and the speed that we need to reach these targets. So flexible and actionable frameworks are being designed and are needed to align science with the reality in light of the ultimate goals of the Paris Agreement. So we are here with a couple of fellow experts that are here to bring light into this discussion. I will start by setting the scene, starting from the latest IPCC report, the sixth assessment report from the IPCC on how we are moving from the current situation, the current emission levels, until we got the net zero that we're supposed to have under the Paris Agreement, based on the two different goals, the 2% temperature goal and the 1.5%. Here, we want to highlight the actual difference that we are having at the global level between the efforts that the countries are doing, the pledges that they're having doing in their indices, with what the world is needing to reach the Paris Agreement goals. We are far away from reaching these targets, and countries so are expected to increase ambition, and the private sector also to increase this ambition, to allow the achievement of the Paris Agreement goals. There are also differences on how we can reach net zero, and this difference depends on the pathways that we are following for different sectors. That depends on the scales that we are having on the regional circumstances. There are also different approaches and mitigation actions that we can take in order to achieve the net zero by 2050. And these pathways are mainly relying on the different institutional and financial options that we have, more than technological barriers. So there are ways relying on a broad portfolio of mitigation strategies that need to be more robust and resilient. On this framework, from the IETA side, we have released this year in April the guidance for the high integrity use of carbon credits. There are guidelines that are designed to help companies globally to take responsibility and credibly incorporate the carbon credits in the way to their decarbonization and to increase ambition to reach net zero, and to help them set interim and long-term decarbonization targets. So this is the QR there. If you want to scan, it's available online for everybody. We have set there different principles. There are 6 principles in these guidelines, to demonstrate that support for the Paris Agreement goal, to quantify and publicly disclose Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions profiles, establish a net zero decarbonization pathways and near-term targets. That is mainly the subject of this session. The use of carbon credits in line the mitigation hierarchy to ensure that only high-quality carbon credits are used, and they to transparently disclose the use of carbon credits. So the urgency of the climate crisis requires action now. So these science-based pathways need to make sense not only in paper, but also in the reality. No? So we need to find actionable ways, no, practical frameworks that allow us, no, actually to implement these targets, no, and to reach net zero by 2030. So there are several frameworks available in this ecosystem right now. Some of these initiatives are here in this slide, from IETA to the SBTI, the Science-Based Target Initiative, the BCMI, no, the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, the European Joint Statement, the ISO norms, no, that is developing. They have their carbon neutrality standard, and they're also developing now their net zero standard, no, and the Oxford guidance and principles. These are some of them. There are others there on the ground, no, each of them providing different options on how we can set actionable frameworks, no, to reach decarbonization. So, with this introduction, I would like to introduce my distinguished speakers. I'm the moderator. I'm Luis Panicelli. I'm the DCM Policy Director at IETA. And I would like to introduce my panelists here, starting for Oliver Gieden. He's the head of research cluster of climate policy and politics and vice chair of the IPCC Working Group 3, that is dealing with the mitigation aspects of the IPCC reports. We have Lorna Ricci from the ICBCM, Director of Public Affairs, and we have Alberto Carrillo from the SBTI, the Chief Technical Officer. So thank you so much for joining us, and welcome to this conference. So I would like to first, just to break the ice, hear your reflections on your understanding from net zero, based on the presentation that I have presented. What is your actually understanding of net zero, of what, how you think that we can define these frameworks, as practical as possible, to be able to help companies to decarbonize. So starting from Oliver.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks also for inviting me. I did not fail to notice that you showed two graphs that had different gases. So the first one was on greenhouse gases, and some might have noted how late the net zero years actually were, even for 1.5 by the end of the century, which is something that is completely unnoted, almost completely unnoted in the public, that while net zero 2050 is for CO2, the net zero GHG is much later, and in this IPCC report, it's actually in 2095. And I can explain to you why later, and then we may rethink how you treat this number. But what you then showed sector-wise was net zero CO2. That's why they went to the zero line so early, but it would not have looked so much different if we had chosen net zero GHG, which just have been later. But I think it's important to see sectoral differences that come here if you only do CO2, not from the difference between CO2 and non-CO2, but capacities and capabilities, but also assumptions that you could question about decarbonization trajectories of certain sectors. But if the second one on sectors would have had net zero GHG, then the major issue would have been the only removing CO2 right now. So if you go net zero GHG, you're overcompensating residual GHGs with CO2. So at net zero CO2, you're already CO2 negative. How much? That depends on the non-GHG component, on the global warming potential, things like that. but you're only removing CO2, and that's for the climate actually the more important part of net zero CO2. So the lesson here is we have always to stay net zero. What exactly? And at least the work report did that by heavy policing of its own authors. Never use the word net zero just without saying net zero, for example.
I think that your graph very nicely illustrates the real challenge that we've got. So the ambition that is needed in order to stick within the Paris Agreement goals and actually where we are at the moment with current policies. And I think this just illustrates why, especially given, I think it's about 60% of the globe has gone through an election this year, which has not really helped to climate ambition. We've got a lot of geopolitical uncertainty. It just demonstrates why private sector action is really, really important in order to go beyond what governments are committed to so far.
Well, thanks so much. First take about this.
Instance. Well, definitely, I think I see net zero as the North Star. It's the aspiration that the different actors in the economy should have, because that's what ultimately will stop the further accumulation of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere, and then the impacts that can associated with it. And so as a North Star, as an aspiration, it means that is what should guide efforts for different actors, different activities in the economy. But it also means that as an aspiration, we're not there. Right? Anything today is very different. And I think the collective challenge that we have for state actors, non-state actors, activities going to change, also going to change, how do we transform the reality that we face today with the North Star? How do we move from the reality that we face today towards 2050, 2070, 2025? I think that's a collective challenge for me.
Yeah, I think it's a very good reflection. I think we should not lose the star of having this aspirational goal. These graphs are showing we're really scared about the speed at which we are actually moving, and the need for more ambition, but at least more practical action, And I think this is the real challenge, because science is telling us, we need to go to a faster way, we need to reach more ambitious targets, and we're actually very far from reaching that. So thanks, Rona, also for highlighting the importance of the private sector, in trying to help also fit into the equation of what governments are doing, and how we can collaborate with the private sector, in order to have this aspirational goal becoming actually a real goal that we can all achieve. And Oliver, I think it's important is to clarify this notion of net zero, because there can be different net zero options, depending if we are talking only about CO2, if we are including also other gases, and how this impacts also on the years, that we are expecting, to reach these targets, depending on which gases are including, on the global warming potential, the stability of the different gases, in terms of year, because we speak normally about 2050, but actually this can be arranged, I understand, on how this can be achieved, depending on the gases that are included there, and also in the sectors that we are actually willing to decarbonize. So I would like to stay with you, Alberto, just to bring us into the SBTI work. Maybe you can better explain what are you guys doing. SBTI has been doing an amazing job actually, their initiative now bringing more than 9,000 companies. Is that right? More than 9,000 companies taking action, and more than 6,000 companies setting science-based targets. So this is actually an outstanding mark and showing the commitment of the private sector with the Paris goals, now with the climate change and with the race to net zero. So maybe we'd like to Roberto better explain to us now what is SBTI, now what are you guys doing? How did you do to engage so many companies, compromising, with the net zero race, and we can actually move and help companies, to decarbonize in this initiative.
Thanks, Luis. Yes, SBTI started 10 years ago. We had our first public discussions on this precisely in 2014 in Lima, when we were in the run to Paris. We were trying to mobilize corporates to support ambitious global goals. And one of the factors we identified at the time was that most companies were not setting climate targets, and those that were setting climate targets were not necessarily consistent with the ambition of what we were developing. And so SBTI started as a campaign trying to mobilize companies to basically embrace ambition and to support ambition at the global level, first through the international framework, and then through the community targets. And when we started, let's see, first of all, it was very different to what we have today. And we started with two pager that was very simple criteria for how companies could embrace ambition based on our understanding of the science at the time. And it was also available in terms of pathways and scenarios we had at the time. And the field assessment report for the LPCC. And so that's how we started. Now, 10 years later, we have also we're in a transformation process actually because standard setting organization, and we started this transformation about 3-4 years ago. And I would say our work is focused on 3 key components. The first of these components is to derive benchmarks that companies can use to set targets. And these benchmarks are derived to precisely emission pathways that then companies can use to set targets for different activities. And we derive these benchmarks from pathways that the scientific community produced and modeling groups. And then we try to identify them. As an example, we have benchmarks for energy, power production, or industrial activities, land production, steel production, chemicals. We have pathways for chemicals, for buildings. It's very detailed. It provides 600 pathways for different types of buildings, different types of regions. And so these are the benchmarks that inform emission trajectories for different activities. Again, you're right, different scenarios and different pathways are available from the scientific community. And that's also the first component. Then the second component is we want to recognize companies that are embracing this ambition, that are setting targets, and so we develop standards. And these standards are the basis. Foreign companies can set and targets. There is also the basis to recognize companies that are setting targets that are aligned with the global ambition that we have. And so our flagship standard is the corporate net zero standard, which is a standard that is a generic standard because it's a standard that sets requirements for how companies can set targets. And then these standards can be used for different pathways that are available. And depending on the it's a company that has different activities in the value chain and operation. And this standard is standardized for the vision process. And the standard basically it's focused on guidance for companies and set targets for rate emissions in their operations in the value chain, so that contribute to wider societal transformation. And then the third component of our framework is where we assess companies against standards, against standards, and then we recognize companies that set targets and targets additional. And over time, we are, as part of the revision process, there is such a recognize the achievement of targets. And I would say in the different landscape of standards, our focus is at the entity level, and we're focused on mitigation, solutions. There's other things like focus on project level mitigation, and we're always focused on accounting, reporting, focusing on the finance. That's one is. Yeah, and as you mentioned, we have right now 10% companies, more or less, are in different stages in the process. Over 6,000 companies covered in the targets, the implementation phase of those targets.
Well, this is impressive. If I may ask follow-up questions, do you have an idea of the landscape of where are the most companies setting targets in sectors or regions? Yes, this kind of
it's very
granular information.
It's very interesting. We do have information, it's publicly available on our website. We have a dashboard where we list the companies and where they are in the target setting journey. I would say in the early use of IETA, most companies were headquartered in Europe, in North America, and in Japan. And nowadays, the company with the largest number of companies with validated targets is Japan. Then we have a number of European countries, and the largest growth that we experience right now is in Asia. There's belief that most companies that are doing this are based in the global north, but that's no longer the case. Many companies are incentivized and in many cases also supported by their suppliers of larger companies. And so this is triggering action and condition in the supply chains of companies and definitely supporting scale of target setting in the global scene.
Okay, great. And in terms of sectors, this has to do the geographic distribution has anything to do with the sectors that maybe are more interested in setting targets?
Well, it's very diverse, I would say. Let me give an example. For instance, one of the first sector guidance that we developed was for the auto sector. And most of the large car manufacturers have already sent these targets in place. I think most of the largest electric utilities in Europe, we launched the financial sector guidance in 2021. Now we have 135 financial institutions that are focused on their portfolio, of course. And then we have companies in the private sector, retailers, ICT companies. It's very, very diverse. We don't think there's a predominant sector because also based on how we focus our engagement efforts, we look at the largest 2,000 companies by emissions and by market capitalization. And we try to incentivize those companies that matter most through the transition to set targets, and so the distribution is really depending on where there's more efforts to bring companies into this journey, and it depends on where the users are integrated today, either directly through their scope and emissions or indirectly through their supply chains or their products.
Okay, perfect. Well, that's very interesting. Lorna, I would like to turn to you. We were speaking about pathways and strategies, fundamental not to allow companies to reach these net zero targets. would like to better understand the role the ACBCM is playing into this equation. Is it going into setting targets, into allowing companies to reach targets? Where do you fit like actually in this frameworks now of companies decarbonization?
Yeah, so the Integrity Council is a governance body for the voluntary carbon market. So we were originally set up as part of the COP26 UK presidency's initiatives. And the reason it was established was because as we've seen from your graph, we need every tool available to us to decarbonise as quickly as possible and to engage the private sector. And so creating a market mechanism is an excellent way of engaging the private sector and supporting companies to go further and faster. So we focus on the supply side. So we assess and have ongoing assurance processes for the quality of the credits themselves. So we look at the methodologies and the programs and assess them against our 10 core carbon principles using our assessment framework. And by doing this kind of top-down approach, our aim is to ratchet up ambition in the market as a whole. And so we work very closely with another organisation, which I think you mentioned in your presentation, which is the BCMI, who then deals with the demand side and how companies use credits in combination with having an SBTi target, because that's really, really important that companies have a science-based target, which sets out exactly how they're going to decarbonise, and then use credits to go faster in their decarbonisation. And so from our side, we make sure that the credits that they use are high quality, high integrity, and our philosophy is where there is integrity, scale will follow. So we're very much focused on the integrity, and it's integrity in terms of ensuring that one credit is 1 ton of emissions removed or reduced, and also supports sustainable development and also protects nature. So it's all 3 of those. You can't have one without the other. And then we have an ongoing assurance process. So it's not the end of the story once a program and a methodology are approved. We have spot checks. We can investigate based on stakeholder feedback. We look at market data, and so then we also require programs to give an annual report on progress, and also transparently report where they've had investigations as well. So we ensure that methodologies are being correctly applied by project developers. So all of this is to ratchet up ambition in the market and support us to move that curve down and really go further than companies could do otherwise. They can't stop their emissions overnight. They have to have a pathway as set out by SBTi, but credits can help them to push that curve down.
I guess part of your work is to assure that these emission reductions are credible, and verifiable. If I may follow up, can you go a little deeper on the criteria that you use to assure that emission reductions are real?
Yes, so we, like I mentioned, we assess programs and methodology. So at program level, what we're really looking for is governance. So it's, does the program have the infrastructure and the processes in place to transparently, for example, do consultations with local communities? Do they report on benefit sharing? Do they have the processes in place to investigate if there are allegations of misconduct by project developers? So at program level, it's more about how the program operates. And even before we started doing the assessment, lots of programs made significant changes to the way they operate. So we're seeing quite a lot of ambition increasing in the space. So for example, many programs are now much more transparent in the way that they report on benefit sharing, and they have more robust processes in place around consultations. And then at the methodology level, we look at the impact, so the emissions impact of the methodology. So that includes, principles that you'll all be familiar with because they're very much aligned with, for example, G7 principles, the discussions under Article 6. So is it additional? Is it permanent? Does it have robust quantification? Is it additional? Is there double counting? And then we also assess methodologies against our sustainable development principles as well. So looking at how do they deal with local communities, how they support local communities, what's the benefit sharing processing, how have they consulted with local communities. And so that's, and what's unique about the way that we do it, as opposed to sort of the high level principles which we're building on, is that it's that assessment process. So we actively look at these, and it means that from a buyer's perspective, you can clearly see if it's got a CCP label, it does meet that criteria, and that takes the burden off businesses who then don't have to go out and do the due diligence. They can buy a CCP label credit and they know it meets that high integrity threshold.
I think this is a way to reduce the efforts by others, no, and trusting the CBCM, no, and the quality of credit. And I think that's one of the things from IETA side we look for, to make the market simpler, no, and to promote, no, the high quality credits. I want to turn to Oliver. You published with your colleagues a very interesting article on science-based targets. I have it here. So science-based targets miss the mark. Can you please walk us through this publication, which is the motivation for that and the main conclusions, please?
So first of all, if you say science-based targets miss the mark, everybody thinks about the SBTI, but that was not what we had in mind. We had the SBTI, of course, in mind, but also every other actor, including governments, claiming that their mitigation target, and usually it's then the net zero target, for example, enshrined in long-term strategies, is based on science. I mean, sometimes you formulate that in your NDC as well. And quite often, since the IPCC special report on 1.5, it's that famous 2050, net zero by 2050, which is taken out of context. We talked about it already. The 2050, the IPCC is CO2 only. And it's very hard. And in SL 1.5, they were really only talking about CO2. There was a net zero GHG number somewhere in the report. So I think that's the first criticism when we talk about science-based net zero targets, to be even able to assess, is this really science-based? What target are we talking about? The problem is that in the government world, there are countries where we even don't really know. The common understanding now is China, carbon neutrality 2060, they mean exactly what they say, carbon neutrality, it's only CO2. Can that be derived? And if you from Chinese scientists see trajectories, oh yeah, they're really only doing CO2. India 2070, they never said what they mean, but being 10 years behind China, I'm pretty sure it's CO2 only. That is the usual understanding. In a country like India, with that kind and that importance of agriculture, their net zero GHG target would be decades later. So usually in global pathways, net zero GHG is 10 to 40 years later. In the EU, it might only be 10. In Ireland, it might be 30, depending on how they go on with their agricultural system, because 33% of their emissions come from agriculture right now, and most of the problem is methane. Then there are targets like in New Zealand, they only have net zero for long-lived greenhouse gases. So it's CO2 nitrous oxide, but not from methane, because 60% of their emissions are from methane. It's me not, of course, talking as an IPCC Bureau member, but coming from a research institute. So the question, first of all, is what are we actually talking about? And can you then derive uniform benchmarks for it and say, okay, then that's science-based. For CO2, what I find interesting, you all have heard the story, yeah, we're running out of the carbon budget, we have 6 more years, it would soon cross 1.5 even under 20-year average. The IPCC says in the beginning of the 2030s. You might have heard that net zero CO2 basically halts further warming with a certain non-CO2 contribution. How can it then be that net zero 2050, even for CO2, is 1.5 compatible? The only answer is because all these pathways go net negative thereafter, deeply net negative. And if you then split this up sectorally, then they aren't all net zero in 2050, and then some go net negative, some go net negative even before. If you look at regions and countries, some go net negative even before, some go deeper net negative thereafter. So I think that's the main argument. There's a general problem with generic benchmarks, of course, recognizing that there are limits to differentiating it out in terms of communication, but also in terms of the monitoring you would need to do later. But before that, really deciding what is the appropriate benchmark here when you bring in things like, you can either bring equity explicitly in there, or you could look at these scenarios and they have these differentiations. And I think the net zero GHG part is a concerning one. You could say, oh, if net zero GHG is more ambitious than net zero CO2, can't we be happy that most countries set their net zero GHG 2050 because it's more ambitious, it's not less ambitious? Yeah, it is. And that's certainly fine, but that was probably based on a misunderstanding and not based on an explicit equity consideration. Another element, and there's a much better article on that, co-authored by Howard Winkler, who was one of the co-facilitators of the technical dialogue under the Global Stocktake, saying, can we please stop making the connection from an individual actor's promise to aligning it to any kind of temperature level. Say, oh yeah, what Germany does is 2.5 aligned, like the Climate Action Tracker does, or this is the 1.5 compatible company pathway, because there are so many assumptions in between how this individual action contributes to achieving a global goal or leads to a collective outcome, that this should be spent. And I think, because you mentioned the power sector, if you look at these models, the power sector and of course the LULUCF goes deeply net negative, and coming from the European Union, all these actors are shying away from even promising them. So Eurelectric in Europe does not say we're deeply committed to delivering towards the European net zero GHG target by going net negative via PECs, for example. You don't hear that. If you look at the pathways, you would need to say, have you, okay, the science-based target for the power sector would be net negative in 2050, because there is not a big, in the power sector, it's not a relevant non-CO2 contribution. So we feel a little bit uneasy because science-based is pretty strong with the term science-based, that is, among others, used by the Science-Based Targets initiative.
Well, thanks. I have a couple of thoughts on this. I think this is the result. We understand very much, pretty well, the problem we are facing. We are starting from an aggregated model, for the whole world, and we need to downscale this into countries targets, into company targets, So this is a challenge for everybody, and I think that we're trying out to do our best, on how to do this the best way. Do you think there's other alternative on this than setting sectoral pathways, or which is the way we can construct, these targets no, in another way or in a better way, no, from the way we're doing now, no, that actually is the way we know. So we're happy that from the scientific community you can provide some light on this.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. As I mentioned, if you go granular, then it's unworkable. You cannot do it anymore. The problem, I would say, it's a task that it's hard to fulfill properly because we all seem to assume that these numbers will be stable. Because what you usually do in global pathways, you have many of these modeling groups start from a cumulative amount of CO2 emitted over time, 21st century. That is the major constraint, and then the model begins to work and charts out certain sectoral pathways. And you also get to a net zero number, usually not because it stays at net zero then, but it crosses the net zero line at that point. And you do a temperature assessment later, and then you classify, okay, this is 1.5, this is 1.6, this is 1.5, a little bit of overshoot. But these numbers aren't stable at all. Before the Paris Agreement was concluded, the remaining carbon budget for 1.5 degrees was more or less the level it is today, 10 years later. The older ones for 2 degrees, the AR5, IPCC AR5 carbon budget was 1,000 gigatons from 2011. In the next IPCC report, it was 950 gigatons from 2020. Nobody took notice. And nobody's pulling tricks, it's just happening. The understanding evolves. Or even something you might find even more concerning, it got warmer. We are closer to 1.5 because the historical temperature record has been adjusted. So in the ways we're combining these numbers, they will change all the time. And you would need to adjust all the, if you really strictly divide, you would need to adjust many of these factors, and you would need to be transparent about it. And I'm not saying, no, you have to keep all the assumptions stable, because that's, again, unworkable, because the tendency in the last 5 years is the last 2 years that the remaining carbon budgets are get cut down again. Then if you directly derive it and say, okay, I'm sorry, Unilever, but your target just changed. So, and that leads me again to that I find science-based a little bit strong. And science-based, of course, even if it's not intended, acts as don't question it, it's science-based. And I think we should question the numbers and where they come from. But if we want to do it the productive way, then of course there's the question, okay, what is actually the problem? We could have written a piece just complaining that the guys who say science-based, and this includes government, but we have to highlight that, don't understand the science. Okay, that's what science like to do. They complain that others don't understand them. That's on the IPCC point, explain it better. But to make it workable, I would say, if pathways show that certain sectors go net negative to achieve the collective goal, that would need to be represented in the benchmarks, at least for these sectors. And of course, when we wrote this, I would say the approach, for example, of the SBTI vis-a-vis carbon dioxide removal was a little bit more restrictive. And things are evolving all the time as well. Not specifically now referring to these scope 3 offsetting discussions. So, but I think you cannot set science-based targets for sectors, for countries, once and for all. You would have to look how the science then evolves, and that will get you in trouble with, let's say, the expectation management in sectors from people.
Well, thanks. I think it's very challenging, but sorry, on how to put this together and to bring.
Just don't call it science-based. But plus say what you're actually doing. I think that change over time, it does not mean, by the way, and this is not really just trying to give you some observed anecdotes. If you start now from a higher historical level, what these global models do, they, at some point they don't start from 2015 and start from 2020. They take into account historical emissions. Now you might mean, okay, so they have to make up reductions that have not evolved. So we have to go net zero earlier now. But that's not what the models do, because they don't tell you fairy tales. They will get to net zero later, because your starting point was higher when they looked again. So would you then set a company target back and say, yeah, well, the new net zero target is for CO2 is 2055, because we reran the models? I think that connection, people in the IM community, integrated assessment modeling community, are modeling pathways, and to derive something from it over time, it can get you in track. And yeah, it's the easy part to say don't call it science-based, but I don't have to solve the problem, the problems of the sector here.
So the appropriate word would be technically based.
I think, I mean, whenever it's based, yeah, like evidence-based policy making, there is no evidence-based policy. The social scientists, evidence-informed policy making is really the best you can opt for in a government. Base is really very strong. I'm sorry that I'm making very principled arguments here, but I think something that is not as strong as base and explains better what are the assumptions that go in here, and do regional and sectoral differentiation, but of course with an effort that you can practically also do, because you don't want to end up in country, but in company by company methodologies, and very comprehensive evaluation. I think that, speaking for the authors of that paper, would be fine. But again, the overall question you're asking here, how can you think in alignment of company plans and targets and pathways with what is needed globally, is a valid question. And I think the most critical thing right now is 1.5 without overshoot, without temporarily exceeding 1.5, then bringing it back to 1.5 by 2100 is out of the cards now. It's in the IPCC report, and it was based on some models still did that, but of course the emissions fell off a cliff after 2020, which they didn't do in reality. So somebody has to go net negative, and we don't even have the promises other than on the company level from Microsoft and some others. On the government level, to turn the attention there, it's some Nordic countries in Europe promising that if you take out those highly forested countries, always a little bit question.
I think we can go for hours and hours discussing this, but I would like to turn to Alberto again, and focusing more on the use of credits. No, if we can give us at least a broad overview how the use of credits now is contemplated into the VTL approach, and then focusing on scope 3 emissions. I will let that for a follow-up question.
For a follow-up question, so the first point I think was one of the Oliver's point.
Just try to speak to the mic because we have online people following the event. So.
I think there's definitely more complexity that is behind companies, and also it's probably true, so as you said, for countries and cities and regions, to try to capture the complexity of aligning their activities to global goals based on the science that is, which I think is what we are trying to resolve collectively. Um, and I would say there's so much that science can give us, and there's also things where we need to go beyond what science can give. Right? So we have to make innovative decisions, and that's the value, for instance, of standard setting processes or democratic processes, for instance. And so yeah, I think there's a bit of complexity, and of course, Oliver and people that are much more, also much closer to the scientific elements of these are very wonderful, but there's also stakeholders that cannot deal with that. For instance, we have financial institutions that are investing in hundreds of companies, and we need to have a way to assess companies in a relatively simple way. And so I think, and then we have the general public, and we look at some of the messaging that comes with other missions, but that's a general message, right? And some may take it literal, but I think we need to think about the purpose, the actual complexity that is needed, to have meaningful targets and meaningful mitigation. So definitely, we agree that. And to your question about carbon credits, and I would say that's another topic that has a lot of nuance. I think it's something that captures, I would say, a lot of discussion around these topics. Right now, the position of science-based targets initiative, which is captured in our corporate incident standard, is we want companies to reduce emissions from their own operations and from their value chains, from the materials that they purchase, from the product that they sell to market. And we also want companies to support decarbonization in many parts of the economy, which is what we call BDCM. And this has nothing to do with BDCM, meaning beyond value chain mitigation. So how companies can support mitigation outside of the value chain. Now, regardless of whether it's in the value chain or outside the value chain, those are the outcomes that we want to incentive. We want companies to reduce emissions from activities where we have high control, and we also want companies to support mitigation in activities where they can influence, and also activities that are beyond the value chain. And now, carbon credits as a tool is a mechanism. It's a mechanism to help provide basically kind of substantiate claims. Carbon credit is something that can provide evidence that a particular activity is delivering certain mitigation. Right? And so when these carbon credits are representing mitigation outcomes or activities within the value chain, then they can be used by companies to substantiate emission reductions within the value chain. And when these activities and mitigation outcomes are happening outside the value chain, then companies can claims are basically relevant for them. So I think that's more or less how we approach this topic. And definitely when we acknowledge the fact that there's activities in the economy that will never be fully abated, or that get fully abated well beyond 2050. There's a need to scale up also the volume of carbon sequestered through both biological means and technological means. And it's a very important part of the equation. It's not only about reducing emissions, it's also about maintaining the carbon stocks that we have today, enhancing those carbon stocks, and also finding additional ways to remove carbon from the atmosphere. And all of those are components that are necessary in the global climate mitigation response. And I think carbon credits is a mechanism that can support these different outcomes. And I think for us, definitely these companies should be reducing their own impact on the climate, but also contributing to transformation outside of the region.
Yeah, okay, thanks. And following up on this, we wanted to touch on scope 3 emissions. That actually the emissions that companies are less capable of controlling, that are sometimes indirect, but actually that can make part as up to 75% of an emission profile of a company. So it's like the elephant in the room, and the difficult ones to address, not because they are difficult to measure, they are difficult to address, no, and I think SBTI is doing quite a lot of work on this, on the revision of the standards, so maybe we can speak about the options not to address scope 3 emissions under the standard.
Yes, definitely. Scope 3 is one of the areas where we see the need for much more sophistication in the way we as FBTI, but also the broader ecosystem, should think about how to incentivize the type of outcomes that are consistent with the global climate goals that we have. And it's in the landscape of climate action, I would say it's a practice that is relatively new. And when science initiative started 2 years ago, few companies had even scope 3 inventories. Few companies had scope 3 targets. We conducted a survey a couple of years ago, and we identified that most companies measuring their scope 3 emissions for the first time in order to set science-based targets. And most companies are today relying on the secondary data to calculate their scope 3 emissions. Very few companies have actual traceability of emissions in their value chains. There's a lot of challenges. What we're working on as part of the emission potential standard is to identify those challenges and to create a framework that can help overcome those challenges and drive the transformation that is needed for companies to align their procurement and align their products to their ambition into the global climate goals. And there are different aspects that we're looking at. For instance, one of the findings that identified through our research is scope 3 global emissions, absolute emissions as a single metric is a metric that doesn't have sufficient units. So some of the emissions that are captured in scope 3 are emissions associated with the materials that companies are buying. Some of these are emissions associated with the logistics involved in the value chain. Some of these are emissions associated with future emissions that companies predict are going to happen, associated with the products that they sell and with the different activities, right? And the type of actions that are necessary for this are very different to align your procurement of steel or cement, or to align life of your products, or to align the use phase of your product. So that's where we are going to identify what are the most effective metrics that can drive the type of outcomes that we want to see. And so we published a discussion paper in July that presents kind of the key concepts and how these concepts are being codified in the revision of the potential standard, and we are planning to publish for consultation early in 2025.
Yeah, great. We're looking forward to the revised IETA version. Lorna, I'm seeing you taking a lot of notes. Would you like to come up with some thoughts of these discussions?
Yes, definitely. I think it's really interesting. You mentioned in setting BBCM, beyond value chain mitigation, and residual emissions, because I think there's probably as many definitions as there are companies in this space, and I think this is one of the real challenges, because we seem to all use the same words but then mean completely different things. But I think there is a worrying with insetting and beyond value chain mitigation. In some cases, this is kind of being treated as essentially carbon crediting, but without the guardrails. So the idea that a company can invest in a project outside their value chain and use that mitigation towards their goals, but without the kind of formal guardrails that are provided by a carbon crediting mechanism. So the advantage of turning this mitigation action into credits is that there are so many processes have been developed over 20 years. We now have a governance body, the Integrity Council, that sets those guardrails and those criteria and ensures that there's integrity. I mean, the same with insetting as well, using a company's own scope 3 emissions, doing a project, converting that, and then using it against scope 1 or 2 emissions. I think there's a real issue here that there aren't enough guardrails in place. That you simply leave it up to each individual company to come up with their own methodologies, their own approach to doing that. So I think more clarity on those definitions. I mean, it's not just SBTI. I think it's just every organisation at the moment is talking about those. I think that will really help move the discussion on. And then the other areas, and this is again a hot topic of debate. You hear people talking about how carbon credits should be used for residual emissions, but you cannot wait until 2050 to start using carbon credits. We will have hit tipping points by that point. It's just, you cannot wait. It's on an annual basis, you need residual emissions in order to keep within the temperature goals. So I think the idea that we can wait until then, I think is really worrying from my perspective.
Thanks. Yeah, very insightful. And I wanted to follow up on some of the things that have been also seen before in the previous interventions on the work of the ICBCM, but in relation to the other parts of the ecosystem. Maybe how you're working with other standards or with governments, to try to simplify the process on how we assure the quality of credits. With rating agencies, for example.
Yes, so very similar to like you have in financial capital markets. You need a kind of mosaic approach to regulation. So we, our goal is a global harmonized approach to integrity of carbon credits. So we work very, very closely with ratings agencies, with the UNFCCC, BCMI I mentioned earlier, and others in that kind of ecosystem. So where we provide that top-down governance for independent crediting mechanisms, like Bureau Gold Standards. You then have the UNFCCC, whose governance is focused on Article 6. And then you have, in a bottom-up way, you have ratings agencies that give much more granular data about the risk for investors. So if you're an investor looking to invest in a particular project, you would look at a rating agency as well as the CCP label. So all of that combined, we're very much aligned in what we're aiming for. I think it's been long established in many principles documents what it is that's important when it comes to the integrity of carbon credits. And we're working very closely with governments, so on the demand side, supporting governments to embed high integrity credits into their regulation. So I'm talking about creating an enabling environment for voluntary markets, not making it all a compliance market, although that is something that we encourage governments to do as well. So, for example, we're seeing more and more disclosure requirements coming out. So in the EU, for example, they say have to disclose high integrity credits, but what does it mean when it says high integrity credit? And providing that definition so that buyers have more certainty. And then on the supply side, partly because of the EU CBAM, but there's increasingly more and more carbon frameworks being developed, and we're working with supply side countries to embed the CCP standard into their carbon market frameworks, so that when they're designing those, they're thinking about high integrity. It means that they can tap into any market because it's accepted. So we've already had a third, countries representing a third of global demand for carbon credits that endorse the ICBCM, and we've got much more in the pipeline.
Okay, you touched on Article 6. Now we are at COP with Article 6 negotiations going on. And I must ask you this question. Are you expecting the 6.4 mechanism to be evaluated by the ICBCM in terms of the quality of the mechanism and the methodologies?
Sorry, what was that? Are we expecting the 6.4 to be
evaluated as a credit mechanism and the ICBCM?
So how we see the two together is 6.4 is an independent crediting mechanism. Sorry, not an independent accrediting mechanism. We've looked at the standards that are being developed there at the moment. They're very much aligned with our criteria and our assessment framework. In some places, they're much more specific, but that's because we're a governance body that looks at multiple crediting mechanisms, and so we're not a crediting mechanism ourselves. But the integrity threshold is the same. It's aligned, and we're working to continue to align on that. So we have, as part of our work that we do, and I'm reluctant to use the word science-based now, but we have our continuous improvement work programs, which are looking at what is the latest science, what is the latest best practice, what's coming out of Article 6. And all of that feeds into the development of our next iteration of our assessment framework, which will be published in 2027.
Well, thank you so much, guys. I would like to open the floor now for questions. I think there is a rolling mic there. If not, I will go and get it.
So, as I was Vice President at NKT, we manufacture and install cable solutions for farms, etc. Talking about scope 3, 99% of our emissions are scope 3. And then when you break that 99% down, around 60% are from transmission losses. And of course, if you're connecting wind turbines with onshore, then the emissions associated with those transmission losses are pretty low. They're almost zero. The problem arises when we're helping to reinforce the grid infrastructure in countries like, for example, Germany or Poland, which is essential for those countries to decarbonize. So you could say a prerequisite for them to get to net zero is that they invest in their grid infrastructure, which will lead in the short term, medium term to emissions. And it just so happens those emissions we have to account for. They're attributed to us. Now, I know that, Alberto, we've talked before, you often have sectors saying, I get having a common standard, but we're different. We are different. And it doesn't make sense at the moment. How do we get around that? So that was the first question. And then the second question, very quickly, book and claim. There's a lot of conversations about book and claim. Book and claim is a system accepted by the renewable energy certificates, so it's already in the greenhouse gas protocol. Can you anticipate going forward that there will be opening up for opportunities to use book and claim system within other industries, for example, within sustainable fuels for the marine sector, aviation fuel, etc.? So that was two questions.
Thank you. I didn't get your name. On the first question, and I think that goes back to Anita's point, there's always a lot of complexity and nuance, and so much that can be captured. The standards are intended to be used, for instance, our comprehensive standard, a variety of sectors, and then the next level of detail that comes in the sector-specific standards, which they're not trying to capture is that complexity. We are in the process of looking at our sector standard, and it's an area where we can look at, and let's go back to that it's considered. So yeah, that's just very specific to the sector. Also related to this is also why we think it's very important to have much more nuance on scope 3 in general. And when we think differently for different categories, I think the current approach where everything is packed into one metric doesn't really capture these needs, right? That's its reality. And so our revision of comprehensive standard is going to much more nuanced in terms of categories and also in terms of methods that can be suitable for different categories. But it's still going to be a generic standard, something that is intended for all companies framework, and then that needs to be customized for different sectors. On the second question, we are looking into the use of instruments as part of the different value chain, so different components of value chain. One guiding principle that we have is we want to make sure that companies over time move towards actually abating the emissions that are in the operations in the value chains, which is you see the spirit of it's a thing. But there's also a lot of nuance around this, right? Like when, for instance, in the value chain, when you look at how you found the boundary of the value chain, what happens versus in a region that you don't have specific traceability to the actual supplier. And so that's really something that needs to be then explored almost at the commodity level. So that's one aspect. The second aspect, we also want to make clear that there's a lot of transparency in terms of the type of claims that companies make, the type of claims that we also incentivize as an initiative. Because there's much more scrutiny right now on claims. And scrutiny from the public, from the media, but also regulations. And we think we are in a different world today where we need to be very, very thoughtful about the type of claims. And it doesn't mean, for instance, when you think about carbon credits, it doesn't mean that reducing an emission here or here is more valuable, right? Because both ultimately end up in the atmosphere. It means that we need to be very deliberate and very careful with the type of claims that we make and we incentivize, because we want to make sure that there's transparency in the type of claims that we make. And that's how we also think about other things. In the convention standard, why we publish and goes through internal product processes, I think it's going to provide our thinking in terms of how this can be implemented, and then we can go through a regular standards process, consultation, and formal approval.
Any other questions? Don't be shy. Yes, please.
So this might be a short question because it might be based on a misreading of the net zero standard. But so just to check, at their net zero target year, a company has to use removals to neutralize residual emissions across all three scopes. Okay, so then my question is, doesn't that in fact drive us net negative? Because the scope 3 emissions that those companies are going to account for are just by their very nature double counting. So you have the same emission being removed multiple times by multiple companies. So while at an individual corporate level, you may not be net negative, at the systems level, assuming enough companies participate, you might be. Is that right? And if so, seems like that's a good thing. Does that help close the gap that you were talking about?
So in the community standard version 1, that's how it's approached. I have to say that's what seemed to be the best approach at the time. But for instance, at the time there was no guidance and greenhouse gas accounting like this, which we hope will be finished soon. And that's going to provide more flow. The way we think about it in the version 1 standard is companies for scope emissions, those emissions need to be counterbalanced. And so it doesn't mean that the company that is emission is the one that needs to counterbalance, but they need to make sure that the emission source that remains is counterbalanced. Right? So they can also make sure that their supplier, for instance, in this case, is counterbalancing. Overall, I would say the pathways that we follow with the understanding of what Oliver rightly says in terms of the claims means that some sectors actually need to become net negative well before 2050, right? For instance, the land use sector is a sector that needs to become net negative this decade, right? And that's how it what informs the pathways that we use. The power sector needs to be net negative before 2050, and some sectors will have residual emissions. But we don't assume that the sectors that get net negative counterbalance other sectors. We still assume that each company has to make sure that their emissions, residual emissions, should counterbalance.
Well, thank you, Berto. I think this is a great question to close up right here.
because it's related on how we are going to reach net zero, and the possibilities also to compensate, or abate emissions, at the point of net zero with residual emissions. And I'm going back to Lorna's comment on the need not to invest now, removals, to be able to have them ready, when we reach 2050 or the year that is expected, for each of the components. So, any last comments from Lorna or Guillermo on this, and we'll wrap up?
I think I would just pick up on it. I think you were talking about transparency. I think that is just so important. I think when you actually dig into it, everyone's on the same page. It's just about what people you do things, and the really important thing that is that everyone is transparent about the approach that they're taking. And I think it's just to emphasize the point that I think just to hit those and to keep ourselves within the temperature limits that we have to keep ourselves within, we just need every tool available to move ourselves as fast as possible towards our goals.
I think that we will run into a situation within a few years where we also have to question a global target system. And it could be that after another unfruitful round arguing about can we still meet that temperature target, are we already over it, what is the next target then? Because you can only declare one defeat if you say, okay, but what is the next target then? And nobody on the other side of this event wants to discuss this. And it would be a huge difference if they suddenly shifted to well below 2 from 1.5 in terms of what kind of net zero years you would get, what kind of remaining carbon budget you would get. I think you could also say, well, there are still, let's say, variables in the natural system where you don't exactly know what kind of temperature outcome do you get if you are net zero CO2 in 2050. But net zero emissions is at least something that is connected to human action. You could also say we could aim for certain net zero targets even on a global level and can then present ranges evolving over time. What would be the temperature outcome of this? You could also more granularly look at these global net zero dates. You could also, with a greater understanding of the public, say, okay, this is a new round of pledges. Now we would get to that kind of net zero a year. Right now we're doing completely opaque calculations saying, well, the current pledges lead to 2.8 by the end of the 21st century, where you have, if you do that based on NDCs and long-term strategies, there are assumptions about these missing 30 to 50 years. Have you ever heard about it? I only hear continued effort. What does it even mean? So it might be wise, even on a global level, and we have that, let's say, sub-target in Article 4, net zero GHG in the 21st century. Could also be a net zero CO2 target or both. Say, okay, maybe that should be our focal point in the way we think about it. It would be much easier to connect it to real world action than to always think in terms of temperature, than to misunderstand that if we miss it by a little, then we fall off a cliff. Because we have presented 1.5 or introduced 1.5 in a way like that, that now hinders us to talk about it more openly. Okay, look in the IPCC, it's already there. It's actually an unknown known. Say it's in the IPCC, but it's not that we don't know where we are heading, but we don't find ways to talk about it because we cannot really deal with these little shifts. And then people tell you, yeah, but you cannot say we cannot reach it anymore because then there will be defeatism. And I think, yeah, but that's for a reason, because that's for the way we started the whole debate. So I think we need to get more granular target system where you can say, yeah, maybe we miss it, but if we miss it only by 5 years, now talking about net zero, that's still a good thing, because if you want to stop temperature increase, you need to go to net zero CO2, regardless of the temperature level you are aiming for. So we have to achieve that regardless of what exactly it will be. And I think that's maybe a form of alignment in how we look at company colors right now, and look or should look at global targets instead.
Thank you, Oliver, for this final reflection now, how to align Paris Agreement with corporate targets, with the climate targets. So we need to wrap up now. I had a real pleasure to moderate this panel. Thank you, Oliver, Lorna, Alberto, and please join me in reading the panels. And thanks so much.